A human rights activist, Kelly Razzouk, is the International Rescue Committee's Director of Humanitarian Policy. The committee continues against all odds to do humanitarian work on the ground. She now joins us via Skype from New York in the United States. Kelly, good evening and thank you for joining us on The Globe.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Kelly, let's start off by this particular highway. What is the big deal about this highway and, the big fight that seems to be in contention? We've seen Syrian government forces having captured new areas from insurgents, and on the other hand, the Turkish have sent in reinforcements.
Yes, as you mentioned, this is a very densely populated area. There are about 3 million people in Idlib. 1 million of them are children, and we're very concerned about what this means for them at this stage. We are concerned about so many different people coming into this area, and the humanitarian needs continue to grow. These are individuals that have already been displaced multiple times. So they have been displaced 5 to 10 times already. 600,000 civilians have been displaced in the last 2 months, as you mentioned, and their needs are incredibly great. Many of them are being forced to live out in the open now because the camps cannot sustain these individuals. And we are in the midst of winter, and it's very difficult for them to get the humanitarian aid that they need.
Now, Kelly, we've just touched on the fact that over 500,000 people have been displaced, with a population of 3 million, which has already been displaced from other parts of the country because of this continued fighting. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has basically come out and stated that more needs to be done. Peace has to prevail. How is this going to be achieved? Because clearly nothing seems to be working, whether it's a peace summit that has been seen, but that was held between Turkish President Erdogan and Russia's leader Putin. Nothing seems to be working. Where to from now?
As you mentioned, we're very concerned about this. As a humanitarian organization, we want all of the parties to come together and put the needs of the Syrians first. Just this Thursday at the UN Security Council, there was an emergency session on Idlib, but unfortunately that session did not yield a ceasefire, and that is what the civilians need. We need the violence to stop so that humanitarian aid can flow in, and so that the people who need it the most can receive the aid that they need.
Now, the continued support and the continued fight or the battle between Russia and Iran on the one hand supporting Bashar al-Assad, and on the other hand Turkey is pushing their agenda and supporting the opposition. What sort of ground rules need to be put to ensure that, as you mentioned, a ceasefire is important for the humanitarian crisis that has unfolded in Syria? Has this become a forgotten war?
As you mentioned, we are very concerned that it's become a forgotten war. And we are very concerned that the laws of war, in particular, are not being respected. One of the things that has been a hallmark of this conflict has been the attacks on healthcare facilities. We, as the International Rescue Committee, operate mobile health clinics on the ground. We've seen one of our ambulances just hit at the end of January. We've seen healthcare facilities repeatedly being targeted, and this is of deep concern. The UN Security Secretary General has established a board of inquiry to look into these attacks against healthcare facilities, and we hope that that report will be released very soon and that its findings will be made public. But we are very concerned about this and call on all parties to respect international law and to protect civilians.
Turkey's President Erdogan has told the German Chancellor during her visit to Turkey just a couple of days ago that world leaders did not act quickly enough in the crisis in Syria. Why do you think he could be stating that? And you know, the fact that this has been a 9-year ongoing conflict with ceasefires, you know, happening, agreements, and then falling through the cracks.
It is, as you said, we're entering now into the 10th year of this conflict. And we haven't been able to have agreements coming out to have sustainable ceasefires. Even when we've had emergency meetings like at the Security Council, there has not been a result in calling for an international ceasefire and calling for consensus around that. And that's a deep concern. Even an issue like ensuring that cross-border aid flows into Syria has been politicized itself at the Security Council. And so countries need to come together. They need to put the people of Syria, the children of Syria first, and put political concerns to the side.
Your organization is on the ground seeing firsthand what's happening to the people in Syria. And I'm sure you've managed to speak to people there, or your colleagues have managed to speak to people there. What's the feeling on the ground in terms of what's happening and them having to come from different areas of Syria and finding themselves in a situation where the attacks keep coming and, you know, seeing all these reinforcements taking place? What are they feeling on the ground?
People are very scared. They're scared for their children. Their children are scared to go to sleep. They don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. They don't know where the bombs are going to fall next. There are really no safe spaces. Mothers are malnourished. Children are malnourished. We're hearing stories of breastfeeding mothers unable to even breastfeed their children anymore because they are so malnourished themselves. So they're having to give their children things like herbal tea. People are having to burn their clothes for fuel, for heat, or even use their clothing to tie down their tents, given the winds and the rain and the flooding. So it's just a dire situation and a humanitarian crisis.
Do you think that world leaders will listen to or hear the UN Secretary General out in terms of his calls for a ceasefire, firstly, then followed by a step-by-step approach in building confidence on both warring sides of the factions, you know, in terms of dealing with the humanitarian catastrophe that is taking place in Syria?
We hope so. The Security Council heard from the UN Special Envoy for Syria calling for a ceasefire this week. Also, the UN's humanitarian chief calling for a ceasefire. So these voices have been united, as well as the voices of humanitarian agencies like my own from the ground, reporting on what we're seeing in terms of the needs. So we hope that international leaders will heed this call and come together, and that a ceasefire, a sustainable ceasefire, can be implemented.
In terms of the response from, you know, the representatives from Turkey, you know, Russia, Iran, are they willing? Do they seem to be willing to come to the table and, you know, deal and face with this catastrophe that is happening in Syria? Or is it just for them a talk shop and continue with whatever approach they want to continue with?
We hope that it will be more than talk. We hope that people will put the humanitarian needs and the needs of civilians first. Given everything that we're seeing on the ground, we could see more civilians being put in the crossfire if a ceasefire is not implemented. And we are concerned about the political situation right now on the ground with so many players, but we do hope that they will put the needs of civilians first.
And why do you think when you speak to people on the ground or, you know, leaders come together, what is the big political issue that cannot be put to the table and discussions being held with, you know, positive results at the end of the day for the people of Syria?
Well, we know that every country has their own political considerations, but as a humanitarian organization, our primary concern is ensuring that civilians are protected and that humanitarian aid can flow to those who need it the most. So that's really our focus and our concern, is that all of these parties can come together, can come to the table, can agree on a ceasefire, can agree that these civilians need to be protected. We're looking predominantly at women and children right now who are in the crossfire.
Kelly, thank you so much for joining us. We'll leave it there for now. That is human rights activist Kelly Razzouk, and she is the International Rescue Committee's Director of Humanitarian Policy, and she was joining us via